My name's Joshua Shapiro. I'm the director of the Intel Advisor Group at CrowdStrike. I'm focused on helping customers build effective Intel-driven cybersecurity programs. I'm here with Malik Limbachaya.
Hey everybody, my name is Malik Limbachia. I'm part of the Cloud Specialist Group here at CrowdStrike. We deal with everything from a posture management perspective all the way to a workload protection perspective.
Awesome. So let's go through a quick disclaimer here. I'm not going to read this. I'll give everybody a chance to step through the normal disclaimer, and then we'll go through the agenda that we're going to be talking through today. All right, so we're going to start things out here with an overview of CrowdStrike's Global Threat Report, essentially speaking to all the trends that we're seeing from a macro perspective across the threat landscape, going through 2022 into 2023. We'll then move into a deep dive into cloud-conscious adversaries, discussing what some of the latest TTPs are around cloud-based attacks. We'll move into a live action view to show you how you can stop these attacks, and then finally finish things off with some recommendations and best practices. All right, let's dive in here. So, bottom line, most important conclusion of the latest threat report is that adversaries are increasingly getting faster at breaking out. When we measure breakout time, we're talking about the time it takes an adversary to gain access to the host and then move laterally into other hosts within your environment. This past year, the average time was 84 minutes for criminal adversaries, with the top 30% being under 30 minutes. When you look over time over the past 3 years, this has decreased from around 9 hours and 50 minutes down to where we're at today, just over an hour. So more than ever, it becomes extremely important to think through how quickly you're beginning investigations and remediating these incidents once you get an endpoint detection. Containing that adversary is critical. When we look at how this is happening and what's leading to this really diminished breakout time across these intrusions, we have to look at the e-crime ecosystem. Access brokers are a key driving force here, and we've seen this type of adversary increase in activity and prevalence rates by around 112%. So last year, throughout 2022, we saw around 2,500 access broker advertisements, and these can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. You can range from actors that are advertising direct access to RDP credentials, admin level credentials into organizations, or even at the lower end of the spectrum, selling vast amounts of log data scraped from different Chrome cookie browsers or other web browser cookies. What this does, though, is it really lowers the barrier of entry for criminal actors to get into systems, because now instead of having to acquire that access themselves, they're able to essentially work off of what access brokers have done and then start the attack by leveraging these valid credentials and immediately begin pivoting off of systems. What's really interesting as well has been the pivot in adversary activity around living off the land. So this might be something you've heard of CrowdStrike talk about before, but what we've really seen here is adversaries continue to rotate from bringing in their own malicious tools into an environment to leveraging tools that are prevalent on the actual host that they're compromising. So this could be, obfuscating activity as an admin user, leveraging PSExec, WMI, and other tools like that. It makes it extremely difficult for organizations to detect this activity because the adversary can blend in with general admin activities. And oftentimes from like a risk-reward standpoint, security teams don't want to disrupt general user activities. So threat hunting is extremely important here. One of the things that we see our customers extremely, or have high rates of success around is looking for patterns of this activity and looking over time to see what trends are associated with different combinations of leveraging these types of on-prem systems. When we look at the distribution of attacks and the speed of attacks, we have seen a 50% increase in interactive intrusions over the past year. So when we talk about interactive intrusions, it's important to make this as like distinct from just general detections that you might get on your endpoints. What we mean here are actual adversaries that are hands on keyboard on the other side of the computer actively pivoting through systems. So 50% increase with an extremely high rate of focus on the technology sector. So where are we getting this data? What's the relevance of it, and how do we get to the level of fidelity when we're talking about the types of cloud-based intrusions that we're going to talk about? CrowdStrike is extremely focused on collecting data from the endpoint. When we're talking about our intelligence, it's extremely important to differentiate between the proprietary sources that we're able to collect from across our vast customer set, and then translate that into actionable information that can drive security controls. So when we look at those collections, we're primarily deriving data from the endpoint, right? And this gives us the ability to aggregate what adversaries are doing, pull this up to the 30,000 foot level and see across vast geographies or industry verticals, but it also allows us to laser focus down on the actual host that adversaries are compromising. We supplement this information with data derived from incident response investigations and an extremely robust malware collection pipeline that enables us to rapidly identify novel malware strains and then translate this into actionable intelligence and indicators of attack that can drive detections. This is all supplemented by data that we're deriving from the underground community. We talked about access brokers. As that trend has increased, we've pivoted our focus to engaging those access brokers proactively to identify and elicit information as to the actual targets of those of their campaigns, giving our customers advanced warning. And then finally, we're supplementing that information with what's more on the open source side, right? How can we take data that we're seeing from other vendors, other third-party industry partners, and then reverse search that through our data sets to identify actionable information? All this data is processed by around 200 subject matter experts that are involved in APT tracking, doing adversary direct engagement, and then doing reverse engineering and technical analysis. So now let's pivot into what we're seeing as a key center of gravity for adversaries over the past year. The development of ecosystems of access has been a trend that we've seen across both nation state and e-crime adversaries. When you think about these actors, right, time is not on anyone's side, whether you're talking about defense or you're talking about offense. So really what we see is that actors try to gain a large amount of ROI from a single attack. What's the best way to do this? That's compromising a trusted third party via either software or direct compromise to get into that supply chain and gain downstream access that allows you to monetize those targets through ransomware or data extortion, harvest more credentials if you're an access broker, right, to power that part of your business. Or if you're on the nation state side, gain access to a large amount of victims for either future destructive attacks, getting that intel preparation of the battlefield, or data exfiltration via espionage. So we can think of a couple examples here, right? Number one, SolarWinds, I think, is top of mind. This is where we had a Russian nation-state adversary compromise an application, insert malicious code into a legitimate software update, and that got pushed out to hundreds of thousands of victim organizations. Typically what we see next is, whether it's a nation-state or an e-crime adversary, they're doing basic stealthy reconnaissance once they gain access to see, hey, which are the victims that are actually going to give us ROI? Because they know once they start conducting lateral movement and executing on that access, they will eventually burn the access, right? And that's when you get intelligence organizations like ourselves or others in the space publishing that information, alerting organizations, and then essentially that whole mechanism that they've developed in that ecosystem becomes burned and unusable. We've also seen instances of this on the cloud side. So we had an adversary that we saw, an e-crime adversary, in two instances compromise a legitimate Python package and a PHP pass, where they were able to get that onto legitimate systems. And kind of the novel thing here was the whole purpose of that illegitimate Python package or compromised Python package was to harvest AWS credentials. So not only are we seeing adversaries leverage these techniques in this broader scope of TTPs to conduct espionage and actually exfiltrate data, but we're seeing it used by access brokers as well to feed cloud-conscious adversaries. One other example here to cover is the compromise of trusted third parties. We see this a lot, and we saw SolarWinds with the Russians doing this. Think about some of your vendors, right? Your trusted third parties that have admin access into your environment to pass software updates or change subscription models and things like that. In the case of SolarWinds, we saw the Russian adversaries compromise various Microsoft 365 vendors and leverage that access to gain persistence and ultimately lateral movement on that trusted third party's customer base. All right, Malik, over to you.
Sounds good. So one of the really key things that we've seen, to Josh's point, is this rise in volume from a cloud exploitation side of things. Year over year, if we're talking about 2021 to 2022, we saw about a 95% increase in the amount of cloud exploitation that has occurred across the threat landscape, given the telemetry that Josh talked about earlier. Cloud consciousness here for us means a couple of different things. It's not necessarily just an adversary going out and compromising a cloud workload, a container that's exposed publicly to the internet. It's also those adversaries that land on the traditional workstation or server and then conduct cloud conscious TTPs. So what I mean by that, right, is a adversary conducting initial access onto a particular server and then running discovery commands through, for example, AWS's IMDS API, right? If we are able to, or one of the things that we consistently see are these threat actors consistently using these techniques because of what data and infrastructure is stored now on the cloud. So anecdotally here, one of the things that I have heard from one of my intelligence mentors in my career is that the adversary is a mirror of ourselves with a little bit of a time delay. This is something that we see in this space, right? With more and more adversaries conducting cloud conscious intrusion attempts, it mirrors exactly, and this trend that we're seeing year over year mirrors exactly the movement of customers into cloud service providers. So as organizations are moving into the cloud, the adversaries really are following. And we see this too, just based off of the volume here. So here you can see the container-specific adversaries, the cloud-conscious adversaries, and the cloud-agnostic adversaries kind of all moving up and to the right here, just from a volume perspective. And this is something that we see pretty consistently. A great kind of parallel that I like to talk about here is kind of with ransomware, right? When ransomware first came out, started to be a little bit successful, it was primarily impacting Windows systems. Then it moved quickly to Linux because the adversary was like, oh, well, here's where there's more data, where we can cause a bigger impact and cause the victim to more likely pay us. And then quickly from there, they started moving towards affecting virtualization environments like VMware ESXi. Same sort of thing is happening here, right? As organizations move that critical infrastructure into the cloud, the adversaries inevitably are going to follow. And they're going to follow throughout every plane of the cloud estate as well. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of real world attacks as well as some potential ones as well. So one of the really interesting vulnerabilities that CrowdStrike's threat research team had identified last year was a vulnerability that we called Crate Escape. So Crate Escape was a vulnerability that affected CRI-O, a underlying technology to Kubernetes. And what could happen when a adversary would invoke this particular vulnerability was that they would have the ability to be able to pivot out into the wider cluster environment. Now, an attack could look something like this, right? The zero-day vulnerability gets invoked. Then from there, the attackers can do a good bit of discovery. From there, they can go and identify temporary role credentials, start to identify cloud policies within the CSP. And then from there, they could start to move laterally within the cluster to be able to conduct their own actions on objectives. This could be anything from data theft to resource hijacking for something like crypto mining, or even stopping services to cause a bigger disruption. Now this is, I will say, just a theoretical attempt, right? When we found this vulnerability, we informed CRI-O, they put out a patch, and we did not see any impact from this particular vulnerability in the threat landscape. That being said, this isn't going to be the only one. We caught this one early, we were able to disclose it early and get things fixed, but vulnerabilities, right? There's going to be more and more over time. Let's take another actual real world example here. So one of the examples, before we get to that real world example, the key thing to identify about that particular Crate Escape potential attack is that it affected both the control plane and the data plane, right? So when we're talking about things from a defender's perspective, a security analyst needs visibility into both. If you have just one piece, you're missing the wider picture. So for example, right, if we only had access to the control plane environment, we could have understood that there might have been a misconfiguration there. But if that particular adversary had landed directly on the runtime and started rummaging around, deploying malware, whatever it might be, that data that you get from the control plane wouldn't be able to pick up what was there. You'd have to be able to find and give the ability for the defender to understand what is actually happening at runtime and then connect that back with what's happening on the control plane in order to have a very complete remediation that is fast to follow. Being able to do this all in one pane of glass, putting on my CrowdStrike hat here for a minute, is really nice. So let's talk about an actual real world attack here as well. So last year, we also saw a operation conducted by the Lemon Duck botnet. So Lemon Duck botnet, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a botnet that's specifically focused here on crypto mining. And what we saw these guys do was kind of very similar to what we see in a lot of direct cloud exploitation attempts. So what we see is that the Lemon Duck botnet scanned the internet, started to look for exposed Docker APIs. Once they were able to find a Docker API that they could connect to, they would deploy a rogue container. That rogue container would then download a PNG file that was actually just a disguised bash script. That bash script would then download the crypto mining payload, and then the adversary would be able to deploy and disable, rather, cloud monitoring tools, look in that local environment that they landed on for SSH keys that were saved, and then attempt to move laterally. Now, this is an even clearer example of why that control plane visibility and data plane visibility are really key, right? From our perspective, being a very agent-focused company, being able to take both the information that you can get from your cloud service provider via the API and combining that in with what you can actually see at runtime is exceptionally key when it comes to being able to defend against these attacks. Now let's zoom out a little bit here. One of the things that I talked about at the very beginning was these adversaries also becoming cloud conscious, affecting the cloud environment away from just directly trying to exploit a particular cloud workload that's publicly available, right? So in this particular case, what we actually saw was a Chinese Nexus adversary conducting this sort of attack. Essentially, what they were able to do was once they landed on a server on this victim environment, they downloaded a bunch of files that helped us get attribution back to the Chinese Nexus. And then from there, immediately after conducting defense evasion, they started looking at the cloud environment, particularly at AWS in this case. They didn't look internally first. They didn't try to look for credentials. They didn't try to move laterally outside of there. They didn't even try to run who am I, right? The first thing that they did was to go out and look at AWS, see what information they could gather from there. And that just shows us that these adversaries are much more conscious in this sort of behavior, right? They are much more focused on what is happening in the cloud space. Now, one that was actually really interesting here, I think, was this adversary that was entirely focused on the cloud space. So what they did was they conducted a remote code execution attack on a vulnerability that existed on a publicly facing machine. From there, they immediately started doing discovery into the cloud estate, particularly through the IMDS API. So they started to look for policies, they started to look for additional information around what was happening in their cloud estate. Once they were able to get some information there, they decided this was indeed valuable for them to stay and continue to operating around. They downloaded from their command and control infrastructure the Sliver implant, which is a open source / cross-platform implant that can essentially give persistence to the adversary. And they ran that on a cron job, so even if they got kicked out or something happened, machine got restarted, they could still attain persistence. The next thing that they did in this case was they started to look for credentials. They connected back to AWS and they started to ping all of the different APIs of the code, particularly IMDS in this case. to go and download those credentials from AWS so that they could move into the cloud estate. Now, when they weren't able to do that, the victim here actually had really good policies put in place. What they were able to do next was attempt to move laterally. So they actually used Amazon's SSM controller, orchestration tool rather, to be able to attempt, it didn't work, but they attempted to pop a bunch of Python reverse shells all across the cloud estate as well. So that is enough story time, right? I went through a ton of different things there. I'm going to invite a super awesome guest speaker to the screen. This is the cloud solutions architect, Nick Ryder, to walk through exactly what an attack would look like from a cloud estate perspective.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick Ryder. I'm part of our cloud solutions architecture team. I'm not going to stand on the stage because, I'm just an engineer. I'm down here talking about this kind of stuff. So, as we kind of look at this live attack, if you're in the back, we're going to be looking at some smaller text on the screen. So if you do want to move forward, I'd highly recommend that you kind of move forward so you can see what's going on. If not, it's okay. I'll kind of walk through what we're doing here. So if we're starting from kind of a baseline, we're going to look at both what an attacker would do and then what we do as security professionals and how we can stop them and get the information that we need to be able to move forward. So looking at number one, and this is going through the entire technical pipeline, right, for how we build images, how we deploy them, and then how we secure them. So we have a Docker file that we're going to use to be able to actually deploy our web application. Then we're going to use AWS code pipeline, automates the scanning of the images so we're getting some vulnerability information from it. And then once the information's been scanned, we're going to actually commit it to our container registry. Once that happens, we'll use we'll deploy our application to our EKS cluster, and then the application needs read and write basically to our data storage, right? From there, we have our logging for our cloud services. And then if you go to number 7, we're going to provide access to the application to the internet. So this is really where we come in as the victim, right, on how somebody could gain access to our data. And then number 8 here is the attacker. So this is where the attacker actually comes in. And like I said, we're playing both sides of the fence here. What that looks like is really starting from a shell, right? So somebody that is somehow gotten, in this case, DNS to a ELB that we have. How they got that, it could be something as simple as you're working on something in the airport, right? And somebody looks behind you, they get some information, you have a diagram open, right? It's all of our jobs as security professionals to protect our data, no matter where we're at. So it could be something as simple as that, and they got that information, and now they're going to try and go and exploit it. But in this case, they have our ELB. What they're going to end up doing is they're going to be port scanning against that, right? So they're going to run an nmap. And what we get is they find that we have, some server on the back end that is running Apache port 80, and that's something that they can actually exploit. So once we have that information, we're going to actually pull down, they're going to connect to the target machine using the DNS from the load balancer, and then we're going to use the Metasploit project to look at vulnerabilities that are on that machine. From there, they're going to actually use Metasploit itself to leverage that vulnerability on Apache, and then they're going to use a script that has all the necessary, variables in this case, right? One thing to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about this is what attackers are doing over that 84 minutes, right? As a demo, right, we have this information already, but this is what they're doing and how they're trying to laterally move throughout our environments. So the attacker goes ahead, they have that startup script, and they launch Metasploit. Once we get there, if you see here in this red circle, our payload's been executed. So now they have that payload on the box. And then we're going to actually go through, and we're going to start looking for sessions that we can connect to. So just the sessions -i. We see that we have this one session, if I can pronounce that right today, that we can connect to. And so they're going to do sessions-i, and then 1 is the ID. And now we're connected to that session. So from here, this is where they can start looking at what's on that host, right? So in this case, we're really looking for the AWS CLI, and this is how they're going to try and move laterally throughout our control plane. So just kind of going back to what Mark had said, right? We're looking at both the data plane and the control plane being, AWS itself. We're looking for misconfigurations, things like that. So in this case, we have the AWS CLI there, so they're going to do an ls, view, make sure it's there. And then from that point, they're actually going to use MimiPenguin, which is a tool that they can use to basically credential dump. So they're going to pull that down, give it permissions to run, and then they're going to get basically all the permissions that are on this box. And they're going to use that to be able to go through and be able to list out our S3 buckets. So now we're going to see exactly what S3 buckets are in there. And as you can tell from the one in that's kind of circled there, our CWP demo stack confidential bucket, right? So as a victim, this is where you're storing your confidential data. In this case, for our demo, this is where we're actually trying to gain access to and pull information out of. So the first thing that they want to do, though, is they don't want their actions to be tracked. So what do? They want to see if there's logging on this bucket. With this bucket in particular, right now, there is logging on it. So all they're going to do with the same permissions is they're going to do a get bucket logging call, see if there is permissions there. There is permissions. What do they do next? Now they're going to create a no bucket logging JSON or permission, and they're going to apply that to the bucket itself. So now we've turned off bucket logging. Most companies, that's going to be a major problem, especially when we're talking about S3 and where we're storing our data. So once they have that, they're going to go into the bucket, they're going to see the confidential.txt, then they're going to copy that out into the stolen info.txt, and essentially at this point, the attacker has what they're looking for. So they're going to cat the stolen info.txt, and this is really at the end of where our attacker journey finishes, right? As I said before, right, we have to know how the attackers are thinking in order to stop them. Right? So if we're not thinking like them, then we're already a step behind. So now we go to the other part where we're actually the defenders again. We're the good guys, so now we want to see what has happened. So this is actually our endpoint detection screen. You'll see cloud detections there. There's other places you can look for cloud-specific detections, but when you want to see all the detections that are affecting your environment, you go to the endpoint detections. This is the one that we just created here. So there's actually 4 other detections that are a part of this. So if we click on it, we're going to get all the details. The biggest thing is we're going to get the process tree. This process tree is going to actually define out everything that attacker just did. So, all the way from seeing what permissions they had, all the way to doing the port scan, or being port scan, doing the wget to get MimiPenguin, all of the AWS commands that they did. We're tracking everything that's in here. And if you can kind of see there where it's exactly the command line, these are all the commands that were run. And so you know exactly what somebody did if it was malicious in your environment. And so as we kind of move forward, so this is where really we're taking 2 parts and we're putting them together, right? We have our CWP, where we had the sensor that was on the container, and that's what tracked all of this, right? This is how we got this information. And then we have our CSPM, our Cloud Security Posture Management. And this is where we're looking at like misconfigurations of your cloud, right? So an S3 bucket not having logging, that is a misconfiguration. It's definitely not something that we want. Or an EC2 instance that has IMDS v1 enabled. It's not something that we want. That was what we actually exploited here, was being able to pull down and credential dump. So if you see, we have 1 critical severity and 1 low severity. If we click on that one, go through, hit the wrong button. So if we click on that one, this is actually going to bring us to our CSPM. And if you see here, this is what I was just talking about, an EC2 instance with IMDS v1. IMDS v1 is just the instance metadata service, but it can be used, like I said, to credential dump. So from here, we're gonna click on that first finding that we had. The big thing is with us is that we're going to find all of the instances at which those that misconfiguration is found, but we're also going to give you the remediation steps. So how do we fix this so it's no longer a finding anymore? So if we have this one come up before it's even been potentially exploited, we can fix it, no longer a finding, we no longer have to worry about it. And so I believe here, really what we're going to go to next is on the behavior side. So this is a misconfiguration, and then we're going to look at the behavior side. So this is where we're actually looking at what somebody is doing, and we're putting correlated events together to be able to see, what they could be leading to, I guess is the best way I can say it. So in this case, they turned off logging, they changed the bucket policy. These things are indicators of attack. They're trying to do something to our environment. And these really, if you see under the violation type, it's defensive evasion, because they're trying to cover up their steps. They don't want us to know what they did. And so a lot of the same information that we get for indicators of misconfiguration. We get a pattern, we get a description, we get a remediation. The big difference though here is down at the bottom, this event timeline. So we're gonna see everything that an adversary has done in our environment. So all the way from them basically logging in to changing the bucket policy, or disabling logging, changing the bucket policy. Anything that they have done that we can correlate back to the end action is something that we're gonna show here in this event timeline. So as you can kind of see here, you go through all of the different events, and we finally get to the bottom event here, where this is our actual indicator of attack, where they put a new bucket logging policy on that bucket. And so kind of as I alluded to before, we're getting the attack type, and then really the technique, the tactic, I guess, of defensive evasion. They're just trying to cover up their steps. That's all it really is at the end of the day. And so then is our identity analyzer, right? So we can see what these defensive evasion IOAs are, and we get a total number of them. So in this case, we had 31 over the last 7 days. It could be something, meaningless. It could be somebody trying to change something in the environment, but it is something that we need to keep track of so that we know when any of these potentially happen, right? If somebody's trying to change their infrastructure as code, whatever it may be, they need to put a new CloudTrail in, right? Those are known things that we can be aware of. It's the unknowns that we need to be able to have a dashboard to be able to see what's going on. And so then as we kind of scroll down a little bit, we get some additional information as far as least privilege violations, credential policy violations, MFA. Really under credential policy is like if you're not rotating keys, right? So for anybody that's aware of with AWS, you have your access key, your secret access key. I've been at companies and seen people have 1,000 days on those things. And it's like those should be rotated probably every 30 days if you really want to be safe, or just don't use keys at all and actually use SSO. Least privilege violation is also a big one. As I think as we all know, just throwing full admin on an EC2 instance sometimes is the easiest way to get something working, but is it really the best way to actually secure your environment? The definite answer is no. So overall in this demo, we really looked at the runtime detection, but there are some other pieces that we have as far as the pre-runtime. So image assessment is a big part of how we secure our container images before we actually deploy them. So we have registry connections. We can sync up to your registries, scan your images. We have integrations with the CI/CD pipeline, so we can integrate with Jenkins. We also have some integrations with Azure DevOps pipelines, AWS Code Build, Code Pipeline, and then also some GitHub Actions that we can integrate into. The big thing, though, is that you're going to get some information about what these images look like no matter where they're coming from. So if it's coming from a registry, on this one it doesn't really show, but you would have the registry that it comes from and then the repository as well. The big things, though, I think for most customers is this middle column, the vulnerabilities. A way for us to be able to find what images have the most vulnerabilities and fix those. That's really what it comes down to. So now that we kind of clicked on those vulnerabilities, what you'll see here is in this middle column, we have this images impacted. That's really where we can target our most effective time. If there's 200 images that are being affected, then we can target that and move on. Oh, I think I kind of skipped detection and went to vulnerabilities, but same premise here, right? 278 images are affected by this specific vulnerability. We can target those 278 images with that vulnerability. really just a way for us to either break down who we need to talk to about who owns these images so that they can go and fix it, or if we have some way of mass pushing to all of these, we can do that as well. So just some key points as far as securing your cloud environment. So leverage solutions that provide just-in-time access to containers or their hosts, such as AWS EC2 Instance Connect, to prevent initial access and persistence via long-lived credentials such as compromised SSH keys. Another thing I think that goes really well in this, and I hope nobody in this room does it, is hard coding credentials into your applications, right? Let's not do that, especially on the AWS side. We have secrets manager, we have all kinds of things that we can call. Let's not hard code credentials. Second, keep applications and libraries within the container updated with the latest security patches to prevent initial access via known vulnerabilities. Once again, let's patch our stuff, right? Like if we take these three main things here and we've done a pretty good job of securing our environment. And then lastly, extend security monitoring to containers and their hosts to prevent malicious activity that evades defenses merely by executing malicious commands in the containers. So it's really kind of what we're going at with our CWP here, right? Being able to get a sensor inside those containers so we can see what's going on is the only way that we're going to secure them, right? And especially in today's world in the cloud where containers can have access across your control plane, that's how they can laterally move. And if you don't have a sensor in there, you're just not going to see what's going on. And so lastly here, it is part of how we want to try and help our customers. We have our free cloud security risk review, where if anybody really wants to, you get to come and work with my team, and we take a look at your cloud environment, kind of give an assessment on where we think you guys are at, and then how the tools can help protect your environment as well. So a lot of great guys on my team, and they all love working with people. So, but I think that's all that I had here.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so we want to open it up for Q&A here. Right? Awesome. So any questions?
Definitely seeing from a volume perspective, the highest degree from AWS, from their Azure, from their GCP. In my opinion here, it's really just due to the popularity of AWS over Azure and GCP. And obviously all of our data and the attacks that we're able to see come from our sensors, and the vast majority of them have been deployed to AWS, and then secondarily Azure, and thirdly GCP, just given the popularity there. Yes. Yeah, we're seeing automated cloud attacks as well. One of the things that I can tell you just from a statistical standpoint is if we combine valid accounts and vulnerability exploitation as initial access methods together in the cloud environment from our telemetry, that makes up, I think, actually 71% of all of the initial access that we see from a cloud exploitation perspective.
Yeah, from the initial access side, it really is primarily either RCE from like a CVE or access broker purchased valid credentials.
And valid credentials is actually higher than RCE.
That's the majority. Yeah, that's the vast majority.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, if you want to jump up on a mic, if you want to.
Yeah, so everyone can hear the question.
As part of the best practices, I was not seeing any micro-segmentation for the containers. I was seeing a lot of good things, but not that. Is it because you guys think that it's a little bit, if I monitor, to reuse the word from my friend over there, if I monitor correctly my containers, I no longer need to do the kind of micro-segmentation?
Yeah. So we do have basically parity between the two, right? It's just AWS is a little bit easier for us to show. What I will say is that Microsoft tends to be a little harder to integrate with, right? So there is, some differences in like the indicators of misconfiguration that we're able to see, but we do have parity across for Microsoft, or for Azure and AWS, and then GCP is missing one portion of it, and that's pretty much it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned some type of telemetry, like number of logins, is there any other kind of telemetry that you would say is indicative of an attack that you guys find specifically going on?
You're talking in the cloud environment specifically?
Oh, the
Yeah,
cloud
it's
environment
probably
specifically. For us, it could be a number of different things, right? So the indicators attack that Nick was talking about is a great way for us to identify what that could be by linking together these toxic traits together that we see on the control plane in order to identify what could be risky behavior. So if we combine that from the control plane side of things with what we're seeing at the data plane, then we can actually see from a telemetry perspective what is most important. So for example, like if we're talking about crypto mining with data exfiltration, we can get a pretty good idea of crypto mining happening given API calls that we're seeing from AWS. But if we're also looking at data exfiltration, you need something on the data plane in order to be able to understand that network activity that's egressing from the network. Hopefully that answered your question? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Can you expand on how people obtain those credentials which are used for mining? You said like you're seeing 85% or something.
You're asking how the harvesting is happening? Yeah.
Do you have any data on like slicing?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like, so it can come from a number of sources, right? Again, people are doing traditional initial access methods. The method of getting on the systems doesn't really matter, but it's how deep the adversary is going. So some adversaries are just going for dumping domain controllers, for instance, right? They're pulling all that data back, and they're then marketing that either directly to e-crime adversaries or selling it on open markets. We're also seeing a lot of like stealers, right? So Azeralt, right? Redline stealer, Raccoon stealer, etc., ripping credentials off of browser cookies. And this is something that, most people are like, oh, well, why does that really matter? And it's often because passwords are reused, right? I mean, that's something I think we're all familiar with as security professionals. Everyone, uses some variation of the same password mostly. So if actors are able to, or adversaries are able to aggregate those around a certain identity or individual, that can assist in brute forcing, right? And eventually compromising, and getting initial access, compromising some type of SSO page, bypassing MFA, et cetera. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, and speaking of like specific compromises that are used for credential harvesting, one of the things that Josh talked about earlier on in the presentation was a e-crime adversary that had abused a Python package, manipulated it in order to steal AWS credentials at scale. So what happened here was that the package maintainer had a domain. That domain was re-registered to the adversary. The adversary was then able to log into the account that was hosting the code of that Python package. There were actually two as part of this operation. From there, they were able to jump in, add additional code to be able to programmatically extract AWS credentials, and we found out after that this had occurred, this affected about, this malicious package was installed about 30,000 times. So it was a really, really high amount there from a speed perspective to be able to gather the credentials to then steal and add additional revenue to that particular access brokerage market.
Right, and one other thing to add there, I think, forgot to mention this earlier, but you just got to think of traditional targeted credential harvesting from phishing, right? So we see a lot right now, really popular tactic by a sophisticated e-crime adversary, Scattered Spider. They're targeting organizations' Okta pages, right? And spoofing those domains. So it's super basic, right? Typo squatting, everybody knows about that. But when you combine that with more sophisticated human-based social engineering, so literally call centers, right? Being able to reach out directly, impersonating help desk employees, and you fuse that with this targeted credential harvesting, you wouldn't believe how many folks will, put their credentials into a spoofed Okta page or, Microsoft Exchange login page, MS365, et cetera, and you do that at scale, you get enough entry points into an organization to, bypass some of those controls.
One more question. So the title of this session was the supply chain attacks. And you actually didn't mention, many security products, including yours, have integrity monitoring capabilities. How much do those really are being adopted, and how much do they really help against the
So you're talking about like a file integrity monitoring capability?
In the cloud,
Sure.
there is some malware that is downloading some Docker or second stage or whatever. Like, obviously, my expectation is that integrity monitoring of the system should detect that to prevent this. How does this in real life helps?
I think that would be less, so when we're talking about supply chain or trusted third-party compromise, we're more talking about an actor probably using very sophisticated TTPs, breaching an organization, and again, inserting either malicious code into a software update package, right? So you would need numerous different controls defending that development environment, right? That DevOps environment. I think the additional piece is obviously going to be when we're talking about third-party compromise of an organization that has access. I don't know that file integrity management, when I think of that as part of a traditional breach or defending the upstream of the supply chain, right? I mean, I don't,
So at least from a cloud perspective, what I'll say is that we think about it in layers. So when we're talking about a image that's being developed with multiple different packages together to create that larger container that eventually is going to be deployed, organizations need a way to be able to take whatever that is and analyze it for malware, for secrets, for vulnerabilities, right? So we have different integrations as part of the CI/CD pipeline in order to do this, including like a dynamic container analysis sandbox, where if you're using some niche product, right, or niche package to accomplish a very specific use case, but it's coming from a random third party that you don't know, you can actually detonate that in our sandbox and see over the course of 10 minutes what it does. And then from there, right, we still have the agent when it's deployed at runtime. If anything actually does happen at that point that is malicious in nature, say for whatever reason that process wasn't done, and the agent is installed on the host that's running the containers, we can see if there's malware being deployed, if secrets are starting to, or if there's a process that's reaching out to the IMDS API to pull down credentials. All of those things would be included in that side of the house. So it's just layered security, and like the whole concept of shift left, I think applies here as well. Hopefully that answered your question. Perfect.
You guys mentioned threat actors being more cloud conscious.
Yes.
Can you guys kind of touch on, from an e-crime perspective, from the spider
Mhm.
perspective, and then also from a nation state perspective, how so, and what specifically they may or may not be looking for from, you know, I guess from an adversarial perspective, like from in the cloud.
Got it. So there's a couple ways to answer that question, I think. First, from an e-crime perspective, we see a lot of crypto mining. That's probably like the biggest thing that we see, just because it's a easy way to hijack resources, get some money. It's like a little bit more anonymous, right? If you throw on a Monero crypto miner, who's really gonna chase that? That's kind of the mentality there, right? When we're talking about cloud conscious behavior, we're seeing one thing kind of really stand up to the top, and that's the stealing of valid credentials. So we see that not just from the access broker perspective, from e-crime, right? But we also see this from a nation state perspective here as well. So what we'll see is that these insert country here nexus actors will land on a particular machine, go steal credentials, and use that in some attempts to move laterally immediately, but in other attempts to wait for a while and then move laterally later. So it's all an attempt, right, to go after where critical information really lives, at least from the espionage and nation state standpoint. From the e-crime standpoint, it's really just about monetization at the end of the day, and finding out where they can best either steal resources, ransom a particular company, et cetera. Like, for example, I'll give you a really good example of this. There's a e-crime group called the Shiny Hunters gang. There was an intrusion where they exploited a remote code execution vulnerability in OpenAM, and that allowed them to land on a machine in the network. From there, they were able to essentially pivot over to Amazon into an S3 bucket. They pulled down all of that data, and then they attempted to ransom the company. They sent them an email. They were like, hey, pay us the ransom. And the company was like, not going to do that. And they posted all the information on forum. So all really depends, right? But generally, espionage for nation states, valid credentials, and the sale of all of those assets for Ukraine. Anytime. Awesome. I think that's all we got on time.
Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for attending. Appreciate it.